Hello and welcome to everyone joining us over Zoom and on Facebook Live. My name is Shubhanga Pandey. I'm the chief editor at Southasian, currently based in Colombo. And it's a great pleasure to welcome you all today here for the first edition of Southasian Conversation. So this is a new series of online discussion we've started today. The hope is to have interesting and important voices from around South Asia and to make this, a running platform for that kind of conversation. So the subject for today is women politicians in South Asia. The idea for the panel was partly triggered by the election of Kamala Harris as the first woman vice president of the United States, and the kind of discussions that generated. And of course, South Asia has a longer history of women in top political positions. But we also wanted to kind of critically revisit and think about the limits of that history. So and also I think about the challenges faced by women politicians today, perhaps also some interesting new spaces and opportunities. So we have a fantastic panel of speakers from different cities across South Asia. And the discussion will be moderated by Lakshmi Murthy, who's a contributing editor at South Asian, and is a writer and editor based in Bengaluru. Just before I hand it over to Lakshmi, I'll just do a small plug-in for Himal's membership. So uh, you can support Himal's independent, non-nationalist journalism by becoming a member now. We're no longer a print publication as we were a few years back. We're a digital-only publication. You can go to himalmag.com and be a member. And as one of the perks, you'll get a free copy of our famous right side up map delivered to your home. Despite current COVID crisis. So we'll try to get that there. So please, after the event, go ahead and feel free to be members. Over to you, Lakshman.
Thanks so much, Shubhanga, and I'm really delighted to be moderating this conversation with some old friends and hopefully some new. And it's quite amazing that a pretty terrible year that's gone by has allowed us to see the possibilities of cross-border conversations so much more easily. I mean, we just jump onto Zoom and there we are. Whereas most of us have visa issues getting across to each other. It's really, it's limiting, but it's still fantastic. So welcome everyone, and welcome particularly to the speakers. I'll just introduce them one by one. You probably know most of them already though. We have Hamida Hussain, who's a human rights activist and a scholar. She's based in Dhaka. She's a founding member of the Aino Salish Kendra, a legal aid and human rights organization. And she's, the history of Bangladesh has literally unfolded under her nose. And we hope to get those insights from Hamida very soon. So thank you, Hamida, for joining us. We have with us Neelam Hussain, who's based in Lahore. She's an academic, a translator, and an activist. She's a founding member and executive director of Simorg Women's Resource and Publication Center. And she's an active member of the Women's Action Forum, which has been active for many, many decades and has also seen history unfolding quite literally. We also have with us Manushi Yami Bhattrai. She's based in Kathmandu. She's a political activist, organizer, and an academic. She's a Central Committee member of Janata Samajwadi Party, and she also teaches gender studies in a college in Kathmandu affiliated to the Tribhuvan University. We also have Ambika Satkunanathan. She's a lawyer, a human rights advocate, and former commissioner on the Human Rights Commission of Sri Lanka. She's based in Colombo. Welcome, Ambika. Welcome, all of you. And as Shubhanga has already said, it was, Kamala Harris literally sort of triggering this conversation. And we began to think about, does women in politics mean women from dynasties, which is quite typically what has been the notion of women in politics in South Asia. And we also wanted to look at, does dynasty alone explain the presence of these few women who've made it to the top? What else are the factors in electoral politics which takes these women there? And how do we also view women in provincial or regional parties, which, for example, in India, we have prominent leaders from regional parties, whether it's Mayawati or Jayalalitha or Mamata Banerjee. We have them, making a difference at a regional level, and also what quote unquote are called kingmakers when coalition politics was at a high in India. So these are some of the questions we want to raise across the board for South Asia as a region, but also each of you, each of the speakers comes from a very specific location, which they will bring in a second round. So we'll just break up the conversation into 2 rounds of questions. And the first round is about, when women have been elected to high office, does dynasty alone explain their presence there? And how do we view, as I said, women in regional or provincial politics? And the third question, has South Asia's women leaders brought alternative styles of functioning? Do they bring a new kind of politics to the fore? So Hamida, since you've been able to join us and you were going to talk about how, women's participation in nationalist politics, sort of was determined by the way in which Bangladesh itself came into being. So would you like to go first, Hamida? So in this first round, we can each of the speakers can speak about 6 to 8 minutes, and then we take a second round. So
Thank you,
Hamida,
Lakshmi.
yeah.
Thank you, Lakshmi. Yes, I was going to talk not so much about what you wanted us to talk about, dynastic politics. That's always there, whether it's Washington, D.C. and Hillary Clinton or anybody else. But I wanted to say that women's role in politics, and I want to look at it from the perspective of the women's movements in all our countries, in fact. In Bangladesh, for instance, women for I don't know how long have been very involved in the resistance movements, resistance to the nationalist movement, which grew out of the language movement and the students' movement of 69, and so on, and then leading up to the war in 71. And in all these cases, in fact, even before, you find, even when Bangladesh was part of Pakistan, there were women like Begum Shamsu Nahar Mahmud, who made her presence on the Rashid Commission, Justice Rashid Commission on the Family Laws Ordinance, and subsequently as well. So women then were so active in their own, not only the nationalist movement, but as part of the nationalist movement, they were echoing their demands. They were raising issues that were particular to women. And as a result of that, I think partly as a result, not entirely because of that, we had in the Constitution of 1972, we had put in a particular Article 28, which talks about equality, gender equality, equality between men and women. And from there on, of course, women have continued to make their demands as to what they meant by, what women have meant by equality, which is not merely on the surface of having a few women in parliament. So then what we see here in women's role in political parties or in parliament is that women are coming in from 2 different angles. One is particularly the progressive women who have been very active, say in the language movement, for instance. There was Dr. Sufia Ahmad, who was active at that time. Then in 1969, with the student movement, there were people like Malika Begum and Aisha Khanum, who were literally on the streets demonstrating and so on. And they were also part of the students' movement. And then how the students, women student leaders came together with the community leadership, such as Begum Sufia Kamal, and formed the Mohila Parishad. So then Mohila Parishad became one of the biggest, it continues to be actually one of the biggest parties, women's groups in Bangladesh. And what we see in terms of their political participation is, I'm not looking at whether particular leaders are selected into parliament, that may happen, but I'm also interested in how organizations like Mohila Parishad and later on smaller organizations that became like NGOs after 1975, how they are recording their demands and voicing their position in the state, and how they're looking at the state or trying to make the state intervene in such a way as to bring about social and political change. It doesn't always happen, but I think one needs to look at it from that perspective. And then, broadly speaking, when you have 1975 in the Mexico conference and the women's conference, women then from Bangladesh are also attending these conferences, and there are more and more sort of regional interactions taking place between Indian, Pakistani, Sri Lanka, South Asian belt, where we are talking about what is the kind of situation that we face in our own countries and how we can work together. So I think then you have the UN conference also acting as an incentive to the women's movement. As a result, I think the women's movement in Bangladesh has taken very many forward steps. Not that they've won all their rounds, but certainly in terms of, they have particularly, I think, stressed legal reform of various kinds, whether it's relating to family matters. Again, I would say that they haven't gone all the way. We still have some sort of restrictions, but moving along that. And some of them then, as a result of their involvement in the nationalist movement or the women's movement, they have also come in and into the parliament. Now, the one thing that the women had wanted was to be elected directly, but instead, what conditions that we have in our country is that women, there is a reservation of seats for women. I think it is now about 30 or 50, I'm not sure, out of a house of 300. But it comes to each party then deciding whom they want to select. So it's mainly party loyalists then gets selected rather than through an election. But again, the women's movement from outside the parliament, from outside the political parties, such as Mahila Parishad and the other organizations, they have been canvassing, saying, yes, we still need reservations. We still need to make sure that there are a certain number of seats where only women can contest. But we want the women to be elected directly as a result of votes by the local people and not selection by their leaders. So I think that is the situation if you look at whether it is dynastic. Some of it is dynastic, some of it is not. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you so much, Hamida. This is really interesting, and we'll come back to it in terms of, direct elections and parties selecting party loyalists, because we've seen also that the winnability factor doesn't seem to hold. All evidence shows that women have really high winnability, but they may not really be chosen. So, so moving on, Neelam, would you like to take the first round of questions to address that?
Yes, I think a lot of what Hamida has said covers definitely Pakistan and probably the rest of South Asia also, in terms of the interlinkages between the women's movements, women in parliament, the impact of UN instruments and international fora, which have built links across South Asia among women, and I think enriched our movements and also somewhere fed into what should be the peace process, but which keeps on getting derailed. So I'll look at 2 points, aspects. One, the seeming conundrum, which, as you in the beginning said, that South Asia has a long history of women in positions of high power and of women holding very iconic positions on the one hand, and yet this is their status or the way their place in the public imagination is not reflected on the condition of women in general. There is a cleavage, and it seems to be a strange kind of contradiction. I want to focus on that aspect, merely emphasizing that it is a seeming conundrum. The women who come in on a dynastic basis or as icons from well-placed political families to begin with, are not marking a point of departure from normal patriarchal practice. They are there, they come in as the daughters, Benazir, Indira Gandhi, Hasina. they come in as the daughters. They are surrogates for the men they are representing and to whom they owe their identity. The fact that they forge positions, their own place later, is another matter. But they come as part of the patriarchal, patrilineal continuum. And then they are set apart as signifiers of their families, of their class, of their caste, and separated from the generality of women. So their status is not reflected on the honor in which they are held, or the respect with which they are looked at, or admiration is not has very little fallout on the generality of women, who continue to suffer all forms of abuse, sexual violence, gender-based violence, so on and so forth. So in that position, they're there as representatives of their class, their caste, their family lineage, if they happen to set up dynasties as Indira Gandhi has done, or Benazir. But at another level, they continue also to partake of the disadvantages of being women. So there's a cleavage even within that iconic stature, and this is reflected in the fact that the expectations from them are at one level those from all women. There was a huge pressure on Benazir to get married because that was the done thing. Also to ensure somewhere her respectability. And I remember one of the slogans by the Jamaat-e-Islami men at that time was, I'll translate it into English, it was People's Party, have some shame, get your sister married. I mean, offensive in itself, but less offensive than the scurrilous abuse she was subjected to from the opposition, which was sexual, which was debasing, which was frankly unprintable. The mildest that I can remember is and this is inside the National Assembly, when she walked in, she was wearing a yellow shirt and there were sniggers of taxi by parliamentarians. So they have the iconic status, but they are not saved from the kind of abuse that the ordinary woman is vulnerable to. That was one point I wanted to make. The other was that what is different about women in Parliament, or the place they have created for themselves, is that the strong links and connections between them and the women's movement, particularly post-2000. Prior to that, women were always part of Parliament, but they were there on reserved seats, and the quota was very, very small, ranging from, I think in the first Constituent Assembly, there were only 2 women, and never more than, the quota was never more than 10. It was under pressure from the women's movement, and again, the fact that Pakistan was a signatory to UN conventions like CEDAW, that ironically, under the military government of Musharraf, the quota was raised, women's quota was raised to 17% in Parliament and 33% at the local government, which meant a dramatic influx of women into Parliament. But so this amplified their voices, but also because of their connections, earlier connections like Nafisa Shah, who was a member of the People's Party, had been a member of Women's Action Forum, had close associations. Similarly, Shahnaz Wazir Ali, similarly, Bushra Gohar. So they were coming out of a particular mindset and from a particular position. And that impacted on their politics, though they had to submit to party lines more often than not. The other innovation that can be associated with the women's movement, with the women in Parliament, is the formation of women's caucuses in Parliament, where women came together in informal groups to work across and beyond party lines. And this in itself enabled the passage of many proactive women's laws. Similarly, these connections with the between parliamentarians and the women's movement facilitated the passage of these laws. Many of the laws were conceived of, drafted by women in the women's movement, handed over to women in parliament, who then presented them to their party, tabled them. Of course, it was a long drawn out process of negotiation with much being whittled out or whittled down and taken away, but much saved. And there the clash was A, with patriarchy in general, and B, with the religious element, where women often ended up as the bargaining counters. You know, you don't give this to women and we'll, support you in that at the party, inter-party level. So that, I think, is, briefly, the impact of women in parliament, dynastic or otherwise. And also the influx of party workers who have risen from the ranks, as it were, and entered parliamentary politics.
Thanks, Neelam. That was really interesting interplay between the quota system, reservation, and also the other push in terms of the women's movement making its presence felt. And that's something we've seen a lot of in India as well, where across party lines, the women's groups affiliated to political parties have tried to push the women's reservation bill with little success. For over 25 years, the bill has just been hanging. And I think it is the threat almost, that's what it looks like, of active women in politics because of the success in a way of the Panchayati Raj amendments, the 173rd amendment. So I think this push from without of the women's movement, that's something we see, I think, in all our countries in terms of trying to influence politics as parliamentarians and also, pushing bills and using parliament for law reform or other feminist agendas. So I hope we get a chance to discuss that further. But for the first round, can I ask Ambika to come in and also just give a little brief recap also about what we call dynastic politics in Sri Lanka, and does it mirror similarly the three other examples that we've spoken about so far?
Thank you, Lakshmi. And yes, it definitely does mirror what Hamida and Neelam have spoken about. In that we had in Sri Lanka, the first, globally, the first woman prime minister was from Sri Lanka. We've had a woman president, but we haven't seen a substantive social change or even progressive laws that were brought in because they were there. And as was said, they were there because of their husbands, their fathers, their families. What we find now is that the examples of those women are used by people to justify why we don't need quotas. So they say, we have this, so we don't need quotas. Or they say, if these women can do it, and they're also used to deny that we have inequality. So even if you raise an issue, not just related to politics, but anything else related to gender discrimination, you would be someone, if I did that, I would be, making a big deal out of it. Or if you question casual sexism, right? Whether it's in politics or even in kind of normal social settings, you're a person who doesn't have a sense of humor. You are just making a mountain out of a molehill. So when you have these at our everyday level, and even when we cannot challenge that, you can just imagine how much heightened that is in the sphere of national politics. And for instance, I think what we have seen is that you raised an earlier question where you asked, do they have a distinctive or a different style of doing politics? Actually not. What we have sadly seen is that, not always, but most often we find that the women also become foot soldiers of patriarchy, because they have to survive within that system. So what they do is they defend the very values that might be the system that is discriminating against them. An example is that we had in the previous regime a woman minister of justice, and the women's movement at that time was lobbying for a change to the Muslim personal laws. And I think she was reluctant to take that forward. And I think that also had to do with the fact that she was a woman, and you're just that made her reluctant. Now we have a male Muslim minister of justice who's made the announcement, and he hasn't had much backlash, actually. He said he's going to change it, not much backlash, and we don't know whether he'll do it. But even the reaction that tells you a lot about how society views women and men. And we do definitely hold them to different standards here, in that men can engage in even the most violent, indecent, illegal, unethical behavior. That would be okay. But a woman parliamentarian does the slightest thing, there is an uproar, and suddenly the standards become much higher. So I think in Sri Lanka, like in other parts of South Asia, we have seen dynastic politics. And it is very difficult for, as we say, an average woman to get into politics and thereafter to survive. But the positive is that we also have had, parliamentary women's caucuses. And to some extent, they have been positive because the women politicians have managed to work across party lines. But still, sometimes they do find it difficult to take it up because they still have to work within that very patriarchal, hierarchical internal party or internal government structures. The other thing is that the women's groups have found sometimes allies within, of women politicians, who they then support by providing information and providing talking points, etc., and trying to tell them, we are there behind you, we'll back you, just take this forward. And that has had, I think, limited success as well. So that, in a nutshell, is what we have seen in Sri Lanka.
Okay. Thanks, Ambika. I think this is, again, it really reflects the situation all over, where you talk about them being foot soldiers for patriarchy. And in fact, that used to be a compliment to Indira Gandhi, saying she was the only man in her cabinet and so on, where, being a man is the highest you can aspire to. So coming to Manushi for this first round, Manushi, Nepal has a very different history from the rest of the countries represented here in terms of no direct colonial past. And in terms of, the other laws or the other kind of social setups that we've inherited, Nepal is, certainly not amongst those. And you've had a very specific history of your own and 10 years of insurgency. And, I'd actually like to maybe take the conversation a bit more personal, since you've witnessed that history yourself as a very young girl. You've grown up literally in a political family. And how does that feel, and how do you perceive dynastic politics in a context where there has been an overthrow of almost everything that was considered to be political or an institution in Nepal? I mean, every institution has come under scrutiny in the very, very recent past. So how do you relate to that? You need to unmute yourself. Yeah.
Thank you, Lakshmi. Well, as you said, Nepal's context is slightly different, considering our history and our contemporary political, transformations that we are going through. But talking about dynastic politics, it's only very recent that, and women in the whole scenario of domestic politics, it's only very recent that we've seen women being elected to high offices in Nepal. This is, after 2006, and in the process of, we spent almost a decade in promulgating, in drafting constitution. And before that, it was just I think the Nepali Congress, where we could talk about, the Koirala family, a powerful family running a party. But talking specifically about women, the interesting point, it's a very interesting question for me, because in the early years of, being in overground politics, because my parents were both at the forefront of the Maoist movement. One of the very first questions I was asked in a TV talk program was about dynastic politics. As I was preparing myself to contest elections in the university, students' union elections, and I was asked if especially the youth are going to tolerate any sort of dynastic politics now on, henceforth. And I was like, no, absolutely not, because we've just had fought a very fierce struggle against monarchy and against all sorts of feudal elements and structures that have governed us. But, almost a decade and a half later, what I see right now is exactly where, you raised your question about, women who have, become prominent in political space. They're largely, sadly, they belong to political families, their wives, their daughters, siblings at times. And although our new constitution is celebrated for being very inclusive and for being relatively very progressive compared to other countries, because constitutionally it's mandatory to have at least 33%, and we have a parallel electoral system of first past the post as well as proportional representation. So even if you don't fulfill the representation through first past the post, you have to do it through the proportional representation system. So there are a lot of women that political parties are compelled to make entry for them in the House. However, the general perception, and it's a reality, that it's mostly women who are close to political families, or belong to financially economic powerhouses. So that's the problem. And I think, just stating this problem is not enough for me, because soon enough, I may also be accused. I am also politically active. I belong to a political family. So I am more interested about why it happens. Why does it happen in Nepal? I don't know if I can generalize it at the regional level. I don't have enough knowledge. But I think in a country like Nepal, where, the institutions are still so weak, and for a woman to enter into politics, and more so to sustain herself in politics, is there's so many hindrances, and for the lack of mechanism, institutional structures, the family itself becomes a very powerful structure for a woman to sustain herself in politics. And I think that is one of the reasons why, not only at the higher level, even at the lower level, because only recently have we had local elections where almost like more than 40% elected people are women. And even there, researches that have been conducted reveal that most of them most of the women candidates belong to families with a political background. Why does it happen? It's because of these, even the material conditions are so poor, concerns of livelihood and all of that. I think if we don't concentrate on creating mechanisms, and not just formal political institutions, there are so many informal institutions at work in a country like ours, like caste, like family, joint family, marriage, and all these informal institutions are at play, which women, it's very different for women to sustain herself in politics. And I think that explains that explains the structural factors that perpetuate dynastic politics. And if we don't correct that, Nepal is soon also, I think, going to follow the footsteps, not in the positive sense, like the other countries. And I hope that being sensitive to these issues and these questions are going to, pave the way forward for us.
Yeah, thanks, Manushi. And, I'd like to reverse the round of questions, the next round, actually starting again with you, because, you've raised really what my next question was in terms of when we look at women in politics, we essentially talk about women coming into public life, claiming spaces in public, speaking out, taking the stage, so to speak. So in Nepal, when we saw 10 years, and this figure is disputed in terms of how many women were part of the PLA. There are some figures which say 40%, 30%, of the Maoist army were women. And a lot of them were Dalit women or women from indigenous communities or oppressed communities. And they got a chance to get out of those kind of oppressive structures and come into the army. There was some, talk also when they were integrating the army with the Nepal army about how more women were left out of the integration process, even in the army. So when you have had an example which is so recent, it's hardly 10 or 15 years old, of women in public life out there leaving their families behind, and we hear so many stories of women just in such hardship actually joining the army and staying there. So what happened after that? I mean, how do you analyze? So there was this huge public presence of women, very, very active. So what happened after 2006? And this question I'm going to ask the rest of the speakers, because each of you have sort of, in a way, witnessed very, strong and huge upheavals. So I'll frame the question for each speaker, but Manushi, if you could respond to this about, why the public sphere, why did that not translate into the political sphere?
That's a very important question. It didn't happen only after 2006, particularly, I mean, because I myself was involved in the movement. So many of my friends were, many of them have been left behind. They're sadly nowhere in the picture today. It was even before that, within the Maoist party, and this was hardly raised, there were only a handful of people who were raising these questions. But the reality was that there was an impressive, astonishingly high participation of women at the lower ranks of the party, even the PLA and other frontal organizations. But the ratio dropped sharply as you moved up the ladder. So, if you went on to the Central Committee or even the Politburo, it was like not even, I think, 5% in the beginning. Yeah. And it never went beyond, I think, 15% or anything. So the problem was then and there that, you could even question whether women's participation was given a substantive worth, or was it, really numerically, presence? Was it just a numerical presence? I would obviously argue that it was not only a numerical presence. Women contributed in terms of, even in ideological debates and discussions, they contributed. Although in documentations, it's only about their role in the People's Liberation Army, which is also equally very important. But after 2006, I think, because we did not raise these questions in time, because the party did not create enough mechanisms to sustain women in political organizations, and before 2006, the structure of the party was such that everybody was whole-timer based, as they called it. So everybody was sharing the resources that was available together. But after 2006, in overground politics, when it transitioned to so-called the peace process, where leaders started becoming more centralized in the urban areas, especially Kathmandu, and they became all of them at once became busy in constitution making. I mean, the delegation of tasks was carried out in a very haphazard manner. So nobody really cared about what happened to the Dalits, what happened to women, and slowly, as the movement kind of started making compromises, as the dilution of its ideals and programs started taking place, the ones who were really affected by these all, was mostly women. And that was because, as I said, in the beginning, it was sharing of resources. It was sharing of all the pains and gains together. But later on, women were once again pushed back to just performing their roles as mothers, as wives, and this is at the lower ranks. At the higher ranks, women leaders who were wives of powerful politicians still were able to, remain active in politics, and that's what we see even today in traditional parties, as well as the leaders who come from a Maoist background. That most of the high-ranking women leaders are mostly wives and now daughters. But at the lower ranks, it's mostly the women comrades now have started looking for jobs to sustain the activism of their husbands. So mostly the husbands are still in politics and wives are not. And so we have this discussion even at my in my family at home, where my husband also he was a student activist, and we keep telling each other that had I not belonged to a political family, perhaps I would have had to perform full-time job. Right now I'm just a part-time teacher, but our roles would have been reversed. So I have that privilege because I belong to a political family. So it's not absolutely incorrect to belong to a political, it's not wrong to belong to a political family and want to be active in politics, but just leaving it to good intentions by saying that, oh, my parents have good intentions, I am very well intentioned, I'm righteous about politics and everything. But that's the problem, you can't leave it to just intentions. And if you're not conscious of what sustains your privileges, of whether there's a hereditary entitlement, towards your understanding of using power and political resources, or even centralizing it, not only in politics, even in the economy in Nepal. I don't know what's the scenario in other countries, but in Nepal, it's not just politics, even in the economy, and there is chronism, and culturally also there is this hereditary caste-based occupations that you follow. So I think that's what I would say to your question, that what has happened is we have made these important interventions at the constitutional level, at the level of making democratic institutions and provisions, but there are many gaps within the constitution itself, and major challenges when it comes to implementation.
Yeah. Thanks, Manushi. But I think Nepal is one of the few countries in the region, or probably the only one, where youth are really youth. In India, you have youth Congress leaders who are 52 years old. So I think there's hope for Nepal still. There's a long way to go, but there's so much energy, actually, and I think that's what's exciting. So if I could call upon Hamida again to address this question about, women active in politics of, I don't know whether you'd call it, it won't be parliamentary politics, but the language movement and the freedom struggle, after which, again, they are sidelined, and what happens to them really? And was it, we've all heard so much about Mujibur Rahman and, slotting women as biranganas and so on, and, that having its own impact. So how would you analyze practically the disappearance of the large mass of political women being then represented by these one or two elite women from, parties?
Well, I think if you look at our political system, it's very hierarchical. And one looks up to the one leader or maybe two or three leaders, and we follow whatever they have to say. And I think also particularly in the subsequent history of Bangladesh, if you have the country politically divided between two major parties, and there's an ongoing conflict between them, then whoever, and I think this relates not only to women, but to the men in these parties as well, they then become total loyalists to one particular ideology or one particular leader, in fact. And I think that is particularly so, especially so in the case of women. They don't have a constituency of their own making. As we've discussed, is, the hierarchical pattern also extends to the families, or who is your family. In some cases, the men are also in that situation because they're there because of their father was there, their mother, or whoever it was there. But also, I think the importance of the kinship culture in Bangladesh, and I think it's true in the other Southeast Asian countries as well, that you relate to people like the formation of these political parties is also based to some extent on your neighborhood contacts. And even if you look at the Mahila Parishad, which has branches in practically all the districts in Bangladesh, but Mahila Parishad was formed initially by the Communist Party, and then they've become more active on the women's front. But if you look at their formation, you have other women who are coming in from either related families or related political parties. And similarly, within the Awami League or the other party, you have a certain kinship culture developing. And I think this is where a woman also features as, not in her own right, as Manushi was just saying, but also because she's part of another sort of historical thing. And if you mention, the women's activism is still there, I think. But for instance, the activism seems to be much more marked amongst the women activists who are outside the formal political parties, but in their interaction with women or informal caucuses within political parties. So for instance, recently, we've had this example I can give you, is that we've had a lot of publicity, particularly in the media, about frequency of rapes. And so all of us, of course, are very agitated about this, getting together, having meetings and so on. And we drafted several organizations got together and drafted a 10-point reform agenda for what it's. But before we could, even approach people within the parliament, say this, or we did try to approach them, but they'd already decided that no, what we want is to impress people, that what members of parliament decided was that they wanted to impress people with what they were doing. So immediately within 2 days, they brought out an amendment to the law saying that, mentioning death penalty, which none of us wanted. But having done that, what we found that everybody, particularly the women in parliament, who had already discussed with us about what is the necessity for a different kind of reform law, were already, supporting the death penalty because that had been decided somewhere on top. And the reason that it had been decided in that way was because it looks good. It makes news, whereas what we were suggesting would not have made news. So I think there is this tendency to build up relationships within your own political grouping. And that's one way of stepping ahead, as it were. And so, but then I suppose women in parliament or we should also look at women in local government, because that's probably a more important focus for them, is that how they relate to people outside and to the kind of issues that are raised outside the parliament.
Yeah, I think this requires actually another, addressing this specifically in terms of local governance and women's role in that. But before that, I'd like to get Neelam and Ambika in also to comment on this, seeming conundrum of large numbers of women in movements. In Pakistan, it would be movements against martial law or the, religious ordinances and so on. I mean, women were literally flowing onto the streets and so active. So was that, again, an issue of women in the women's movement not going into politics? Or what was this large mobilization about, which did not then see a lot of women in parliamentary politics?
Yeah, I think as far as movements of resistance to martial law, etc., are concerned, they were largely middle-class movements. Women from those movements went into parliamentary politics, but I'm very few into local government. And those two were women like, again, Nafisa Shah, who came from political parties, whose families were from already established members in political parties. And it was, I think, at the behest of their fathers or whoever that the decision was taken. Insofar as women's participation in larger politics, I think one could say partition was one moment when women were active in the freedom movement, women possibly across class, but there it suffered the same, followed the same pattern as elsewhere. Once independence has been won or the immediate object achieved, patriarchy resurges and women are pushed back into their conventional roles. As far as women in local government are concerned, we have to keep in mind that Pakistan, out of its 70x many years of existence, has been under martial law for at least 30, of those years, and the rest have been sort of specious democracies with the shadow of military rule somewhere hovering in the background, and often not so much in the background either. So women in local government, the presence has been low initially. When was the first local government election held? I think it was under Ayub Khan, who started set up the institution of basic democracies, which was an indirect form of election to ensure that he would win. And subsequently, there were non-party local government elections under Zia. I think none were held under Bhutto, though they were planned. So that space is relatively new. Women traditionally followed a particular pattern. I mean, this was my experience in the 88 election, immediately after Zia, of women who were in local government or at some level in community politics, but openly saying, but we do as our men, the men will have to tell us what to do, kind of thing. And it was a given. I think that pattern has spilt over even when, with the influx of, I think it was 40,000 women into local government once the Musharraf raised the quota for women at local government. I think the majority were following a similar pattern where they were representing family interests, even if they wanted to be there in their own right. They were there courtesy families. Some were not even there willingly or a sort of passive entrance. And it was providing a foothold to the men of the family in local government. Currently, these days, but also there was a shift. Again, there is a linkage between the women's movement, between NGOs and women in local government. Now, this must have been a pinch of salt in the ocean given our population dynamics. But political education programs had been undertaken, initiated by Aurat Foundation and the brainchild of Southasia and Nigar Ahmed, where across party lines at a national level, they were giving, creating awareness through political education at the community level. And this agenda or this program was then replicated by many others. It couldn't have made much of a difference given the size of the population, but I think it did have an impact because a lot of women who stood for elections for local government had come out of groups that had their political, been through these political education programs. So they were more aware. But then there were others who were there because they were there. And even today, these days, we are working with community women and at the local government, ex-local government representatives and prospective representatives, and also with community-based organizations. And it's difficult. I mean, they have to push their way. In local government, they are often, it is expected their husbands will represent them. They don't even have to leave the house. Those of them who do go there don't have office space, don't have access to funds, are missed out in regular meetings. On the other hand, they have strong links with the women's communities, because women are easier talking to them and bring their problems to them. So again, there's a gap of what they can do and what they are not given the space to do. And this is witnessed again and again, because they were saying we remain chotas. You know, the tea boys at the chai shops in the bazaar. They are called in to gather people for a rally, to bring in or to do other sort of perform other functions. But when it comes to authority or power or even a voice, they're pushed aside, not just by their own peers at the local government level, but even at the party level. And at the party level, they are more or less given instructions as to what they do, and they do follow party lines. Though again, it was interesting that we were meeting local government reps from different parties in the same space. They got on perfectly well. They shared the same problems. They shared experiences, but were very careful that the meetings should be held in neutral places, because they were not willing to go into each other's party spaces because of the political divides and antagonisms between different parties. So there is a lot of room for improvement there to provide women with access to voice and to resources, because they know what they have to do. Most of them are very aware, conscientized women, building linkages, identifying the issues of the community, living the issues of the community. They belong to the same areas, but having no recourse to meeting those demands or responding to those voices. And it was funny, because of COVID, we are having a lot of our work is being done online, and women don't, again, a question of resources, women don't always have access to smartphones. So the meeting was held in the office of a community-based organization headed by a man who would not let this woman get hold of the mic, and kept on saying, I will tell you what she wants. And finally I had to yell at him and say, look, give her the mic. And by the time she came on, she was laughing, but she was also sort of exasperated. And so it is at that minute level that patriarchy speaks, and patriarchy has power. And it is that mindset. And I think that is where we need to put in a lot of work.
Yes, no, absolutely.
How we do it, I don't know.
Yeah, absolutely, because we've had the same issue in India for years, in terms of, the sarpanch patis, what is called, where you have women sarpanches, and it's actually their husbands who are even sitting on the meeting. Sometimes they don't let the woman sarpanch sit on a chair. It's just so blatant. But things are changing. But just to allow Ambika to come in on this question about women in public life or in the public sphere, and in Sri Lanka, I guess the huge thing would be the war and women's participation. Do you think that has had any impact in terms of women's political participation after the war? Or and also for you, the question of ethnic identity. So when we talk about women's participation, how strong is the ethnic identity in terms of, do they identify as Tamil politicians, for example, or Tamil women politicians, or where does that come in? Because that's such an integral part of politics in Sri Lanka.
If we look at women in, I mean, all of you were talking, I was thinking, is that we have ethnicity-based parties, right? So we have the Tamil parties, we have the Muslim parties, and then we have the main parties. There are Tamils and Muslims in the main parties as well, but once again, not always in like the high party positions. If you look at representation of women, I think particularly at the national level, you definitely have more women in the main, parties rather than in the Tamil or Sinhala parties. Now, this you could say partly is because also of the armed conflict, which adversely affected the communities and made political mobilization, all that difficult, etc. All that I think partly would be correct. But partly, I think Tamil and Muslim communities are also definitely more conservative. So it will be more difficult for Tamil and Muslim women to come into politics. And there are various factors at play. For instance, if you are a Tamil woman, then if you want to get elected, there is no way that you can be critical of the LTTE. If you are critical, then that's pretty much it. Then if you are a Muslim woman, there are certain things that you have to be careful, you cannot speak. So for instance, there's a few years ago, she was more like a social activist, a Muslim woman who spoke out in support of sex workers, rights of sex workers. She received death threats to the point where she had to move to another part of the country. So I think these women, because of the societies, they face additional obstacles. So if you're talking about women from the conflict affected areas, many of them would also be their kind of economic social capital would have been decimated. The social networks have, in a way, they have crumbled, but also reforming, but in different ways. So you're also seeing social change, which the community has not come to terms with, right? They're also grappling with these changing values. So in that context, I think particularly within the Tamil community, what you saw is, I think everyone knows the women combatants. The LTT had a large number of women combatants. Following, but in the hierarchy, once again, within the party, of course, they did not hold the visibly high positions. And following the end of the war, they had to revert back to, and I've interviewed about 50 women combatants, and they were saying things like, I can't even, and one woman said she doesn't, husband was disappeared. So she said a tree in her yard, that the branches were like overgrown. So she said she just didn't think anything about it. She just stood up and started like chopping it. But the neighbors saw her and they were just like, what's going on here? Like, why is she doing this? And she said, so they found it odd. And then they start wondering, well, where is she from? This was, of course, a few years ago, just after the end of the war, because there was stigma attached to the combatants generally, because the war ended militarily. Some of them were handed over to the military and they disappeared. Then there was surveillance monitoring of the people who were even sent to rehabilitation. Rehabilitation did not adhere to human rights standards. So the women, for them, you can imagine how difficult this context would be. And then to become socially active. So what we are seeing now is after that reversion back to more traditional conservative values. So for instance, in the North, you saw dowry became an issue again. All these things that the LTT had forcibly and through fear of violence had in a way just, it was not eradicated. It was just in a way submerged, I suppose, for a short while. It just came up again. But what we are seeing now, I think, is, or what we saw in the past 5 years also, because we had regime change and there was space for civil society, there was space for dissent. We saw many more women and groups coming out. So, for instance, the struggle for the return of land that was taken over by the military in the North, mostly women. But the women themselves face a lot of struggles at home because the husbands sometimes even use violence on them. They perpetrate violence because why are you going there every day? You're not working, you're wasting your time going there for the protest every day for the past 100 days. But you're seeing social activism, you're seeing younger women also coming forward using social media. But once again, there is a lot of backlash. a lot of sexualized cyber violence is being perpetrated. So I think in a way, Sri Lanka it's going through a lot of upheavals, but women still face considerable struggles in getting from that point of social activism. Or, we have had a protest by the families of the disappeared for hundreds of days now. All women, mothers, wives, mostly women. But to get from that point into party politics, and that from the party politics to get into parliament, I think that you still need privilege, you still need, backing of powerful people, you still need to be someone, as it were.
Thanks, Ambika. I mean, that's really fascinating what you, even mentioned about a resurgence of some of the social customs which had been banned or maybe petered away under the LTT, like dowry and so on. And I also know that there were very stringent consequences for domestic violence, within that. One may or may not agree with the kinds of justice meted out, but, well, I mean, there was a recognition that this is not okay. So thank you for that. And that actually leads me to the next question I wanted to pose to all of you. In terms of even when Kamala Harris, she was not yet elected at the time, there were a lot of discussions about, is she going to bring a different kind of politics to the White House? I mean, is a woman there going to bring a change policy in any way? Is there going to be a difference in the way the US, and the reason I guess all of us were riveted even to, elections in a country nowhere near ours was simply because it does matter, US policy affects everyone, unfortunately. So that question, I think it remains to be seen whether she's going to bring any different kind of politics in terms of a gender element to it. And we have, within, even in the Indian women's movement, we've questioned this whole, essentialism about women being kinder or less corrupt, or, all of these stereotypes about women. But recently, I came across this study during, the response to the coronavirus pandemic, where it says that the countries with the best response to the COVID-19 pandemic are led by women. So there's this study which looks at Germany under Angela Merkel, New Zealand's Jacinda Ardern, of course, Denmark's Mette Frederiksen, Taiwan's Tsai Ing-wen, and Finland's Sanna Marin. So all of these countries had a better response to coronavirus in terms of more humane lockdowns, lower death rates, and fewer adverse impacts of the pandemic in general. And interestingly, none of these women actually belong to political dynasties. Most of them have come up from the cadre. They've climbed the political ladder, and they're leading, and they're all elected representatives. So I was wondering, do we need to rethink this? Do we need to relook at and maybe come back to looking at, do women have a different style of leadership and a different style of politics? And does the current mainstream political frame in all these countries allow women to anyway exercise that different style? And would you have any examples of, women leaders who've actually driven any different kind of change? We've seen those studies in India in the Panchayati Raj system. It's been now 25 years, so there's been time to study that women leaders do tend to attend more to local issues, and issues which concern women, whether it's water, fodder, schools and health and that kind of thing. So that's really at a very local governance level, and we've not seen evidence of it at the higher levels in terms of any of our women politicians. So I'd really like you to comment on this in terms of style of politics, and whether there are examples, and whether there is hope, and what does it need for women's style to flourish in a way. So maybe we can go in the same order. Again, Manushi first.
As you yourself said, about essentializing women's roles and their traits, I would also, I would tend to think that, as much as I would like to be very happy and hopeful about Kamala Harris or any woman leader rising to prominence, but I'm also skeptical if there is something very inherently good and hopeful about having women in these positions. My key concern would be what is the politics that they represent, rather than just their style of functioning, because I think one determines the other as well. If we just talk about the style itself, I would focus more on whether I think I would talk more about style if I knew that women in Nepal were allowed to govern or perform independently, think and act independently without being controlled by men in their party or in their family. But that apart, I think it's what politics do you bring to the table? What agenda do you bring, and who do you represent? So I think for any woman leader, I would judge based on that, because in Nepal, we have a president, the first president, the second president of Nepal, who's a woman, the first ever woman to be a president. We've also had at one point key, constitutional positions being filled by women, the speaker, the chief justice, and who not. But when we talk about the president, especially in the current scenario, it's been a big disappointment for us. She has approved the unconstitutional dissolution of the House of Representatives and has issued several other controversial ordinances. And even at the local level, the local government and the provincial level, where I'm more hopeful about, the performances of women leaders. But there have been studies being conducted, and my own personal experience of, talking with them is that they've largely been reduced to these subsidiary positions, not the mayors, but the sub mayors or the deputy mayors or the deputy heads of bodies and ward levels. And as Sarah Tamang, who was brilliantly put in an article she's titled it, "They've given us the chair, but bound our hands and feet." So, even when women really want to perform, what are the hindrances? And it's not just, I think, patriarchy. In a country like Nepal, there are like layers and layers of hierarchies and obstacles that are intersectional in nature. So, a woman who belongs to a Khas Arya community will bring something different to the table as opposed to a Dalit woman or a woman from a Janjati background. I think she's going to bring something different in her, political tasks. So I think there could be many examples, but as long as there are these visible and invisible structures that hinder, that present themselves as hindrances in every step for women politicians, I can't say with confidence that, women are going to bring change in the positive sense by the fact that they are just, women. Because even our president, she hardly had any response of empathy or anything during the COVID-19 crisis in Nepal. So what does that say in comparison to, say, Jacinda Ardern or other women leaders? So I think that would be my response. I would focus on the politics that they represent.
Yeah. Thanks, Manushi. Hamida, would you like to respond to this about, women's style of functioning and politics, as Manushi very rightly pointed out, in terms of them making a different kind of impact?
I'm not really sure that they do, because I think those of us who are outside politics, political parties, function a different way. I think we feel freer to speak and do what we want to do. There's fewer restrictions and fewer rules on us. Whereas I find the political system in our country is so hierarchical that you join, it's like you have to promise to obey and so on and so forth.
Yeah.
It's very difficult to move out of that. And so if you want something done, for instance, I mean, recently there have been incidents, but the incidents of rape that I talked about, but women in parliament didn't raise any of these issues in parliament itself, also, although it was a session. We have a speaker who's a woman, but she didn't raise it either. She didn't talk about it in any way. Whereas we were talking about it outside. So I think there are too many, nuts and bolts within a political party, and they all lead in a very hierarchical direction. That's why I think it's probably a little freer where the local politics are concerned, but I'm not too familiar with that. But in Bangladesh, for instance, we have a lot of other community organizations. And the way this is going now is that for community organizations, whether they're all female or mixed or whatever they are, their tendency to interact with people, with the political forces, and to make them try and understand what are the issues. And I think this is particularly, say, in the case of the Chittagong Hill tracks, where people tend to talk about it outside, but not inside Parliament.
Yeah, I mean, these are very, I think, volatile issues which are cross gender, I guess, and cross party. Neelam, would you like to respond to that in terms of looking at?
Yeah, I agree with, Hamida has made a very interesting point, but to go back to your women nicer, I am very wary of essentialisms. I think whether it's Kamala Harris or whether it was Obama, they have to follow the policies of their country. And those are neoliberal policies, and they will start wars, they will be violent, they will be oppressive, they will be exploitative as far as the rest of the world is concerned. And I think being female or black has nothing to do with it. The other thing about different style of politics, and going back to what Amida was also saying, there's also the politics of place and location and identity. It was more difficult for Benazir to push for progressive change than for a male, more right-wing counterpart, because she already carried with her the stigma or burden of being a woman, belonging to a party which had at least a left-wing aura attached to it. Whether it was there in reality or not is another matter. But it was a sort of modern, in the negative sense, party, as seen by the public in Zia's time, post-Zia Pakistan. So similarly, for People's Party, it was more difficult. For instance, People's Party could not have switched the Friday holiday back to Sunday. It would have been called an atheistic society, because one of the things Zia did was to popularize the meaning of the word secular as atheistic. So there's a negative knee-jerk reaction to it. But Nawaz Sharif did. I mean, it was no problem. It happened with great ease, and we came back to Sunday. So it is all these politics also at work. So it is difficult to say where the difference would be, because as Hamida has said, women in politics are bound by party lines, by party political hierarchies, and behind them there are then the family hierarchies and all that baggage as well. So no, I would not essentialize on that. But as you say, it is outside formal structures that perhaps, because of and where they come from, and perhaps because through discussions, through understanding, through awareness, there may be a greater sensitivity to what are people's issues, to what is the more humane aspect of things than to the norm, which is pretty brutal. Yeah. When we look at our stereotypes and our caste, class divisions and all that. And there you will find women as hidebound about caste and class as your most misogynistic of men.
Oh, yes. I mean, yeah, I mean, and we've also seen that, in terms of the right-wing politics, it's the right-wing parties in India. I'm not so sure about Pakistan or Bangladesh, which have a higher representation of women, actually. In terms of even fielding women candidates, it's the BJP who've fielded more women candidates always. So anyway, Ambika, would you like to respond to this about, a gendered politics? Is there any such thing?
It's an interesting question, because a question about, is it enough to have women there, or do they need to have a certain kind of politics? That discussion is very actively going on in Sri Lanka now because of the recent elections. We had a woman who was a human rights activist and lawyer who joined a political party that is headed by a person including accused by the United Nations and the special representative on children in armed conflict, as well as someone who has alleged to have committed grave human rights and humanitarian law violations. So then within the women's groups itself, there was a lot of conflict and a lot of conversation, because should we support this woman or not? Because they had a campaign which said, vote for a woman. So then women themselves started challenging this and said, but we don't want to vote for her. She doesn't stand for our values. She's supporting a party that is accused of grave human rights violations. Then we got into a conversation in Sri Lanka where a woman parliamentarian just a couple of months ago said that national security is more important than sanitary napkins, which caused this huge uproar. And then so everyone's like, women, need to be feminists. So then the conversation was, do you need representation for representation's sake, or do you need the women to have a certain kind of politics? I personally think, when we say we need ethnic representation, religious representation, whatnot, we don't talk about their politics. So I think we do need to have representation for representation's sake. But I personally, and I would encourage others to also demand those women to have a certain kind of politics. But I don't think we should prevent their entry into politics because of the kind of politics that, we should challenge it, definitely. So I think, and also to say how deeply ingrained this is recently, just yesterday, a study was launched in Sri Lanka, interviews with women politicians at the local government level. 2/3 of them said politics is more suited for men than women. There's one woman who said, if a woman is in politics, she must know to get those positions within the party. You can't blame the men for not giving them to her. She must know how to get them. Then there was a seasoned 60-year-old woman politician who had said, men, they use their muscle in politics. So what we must do is we must find something else that is unique to ourselves and use that. So once again, the problem is using muscle is not a problem. We're not challenging the fundamental structural systemic, problems, or the problems with our values and the kind of politics we practice. So as I said, these women have kind of become foot soldiers of patriarchy.
Yeah, I mean, and I think this is again at all levels where sexism is so very strong. In terms of whatever women do, it's because they are women. Whatever bad they do, and whatever good they do is because they're good politicians. So I mean, you can never win, really. You just can't win. So we're getting a few questions. Maybe we can take these questions, and if there's a lull in the questions, maybe you can add any points that you'd like to. So there's one question for Neelam. Neelam, how do you explain Benazir being supported as the heir when she had a brother who was also involved in politics? In a patriarchal society, was this not a break from tradition?
Yeah, I suppose you could say it was a break from tradition, but Bhutto had named her his political heir. Maybe she was the eldest child. Bhutto died pretty young when the children were not that old. Perhaps as the eldest child with a promise, he felt that she could represent him. But certainly when she came into power or after his death, the brothers were not in the country. They left earlier. They were involved in a different kind of politics, and she came to represent him. And then when she was in exile also, she was the one who came back first. And I mean, I'm not just thinking aloud. It was amazing, the reception she got. And she was there as Bhutto's daughter, the surrogate of the man they had lost, perhaps with a lot of guilt for his hanging also. And she sort of never lost that space. And later, when Murtaza did sort of emerge as a possible contender for power, I don't think he could dislodge her. Not really. Because, I mean, those were the days one was attending their rallies and their meetings and things. And he did not have the ability to attract the same kind of crowd. I think by the time he came back, she had captured the public imagination. And it was more than just as a political person. There was an iconic quality that status that she had attained, where much was forgiven her. Her lapses, shortfalls were criticized. But despite that, her constituency remained, and I think it is sort of somewhere reflected in the fact that, though that maybe that has something to do with South Asian culture, that her grave is now a place of pilgrimage also. Maybe an honor conferred by her assassination. Though,
and the rumors of her having done away with the brother and so on, that has not affected her popularity.
Well, the rumors were there, but also alongside those rumors, they were not proved, just as Benazir's, it hasn't been discovered who killed her, though there are many rumors. But there was also this rumor going around that the tension was between Murtaza and Zardari, and not so much between Benazir and Murtaza. I mean, I don't know. I have no information really. I'm sort of just going on things I've heard. So I wouldn't like to state definitively it could be this or it could be that. But again, if you look at it, it seems to be a kind of battle for power between two males. Or maybe it wasn't. I mean, I don't know enough, or don't have enough information to be able to comment.
Okay. There are a couple of questions for everyone. I'll read out both, and if you can respond to both, whoever would like to, or all of you. One is, how many male politicians are from political families and with political lineage? I would think that almost half of parliament are from political families and local power structures. That's one. Another question is, do you think that our education systems play a role in instilling or not instilling leadership skills in women? So these two questions, and then we can go on. So about political lineage itself, that even men, I think all of you have commented, but if you have any data perhaps of how many men, male politicians are from political families or political lineage in your context. And the other question about education. Is that an issue? And I would add to that, if it is an issue, why is it not an issue for men? You know.
I think, can anyone answer? I mean, I don't have the data, but I think a large number of men in politics are from political families or from economically very strong families who have entered politics and set up their own made a place for themselves, and maybe initiated continuities also. I can't say. But as far as education is concerned, the Pakistani education system is not geared to engender leadership qualities in anybody, certainly not in women, maybe in the army. because the valorization is of military figures, of religious figures, and of nationalist icons like Jinnah or the poet Iqbal. But no, if anything, our education system constrains women, non-Muslim minorities, other marginalized groups within the stereotypes of gender and class and caste and religion, and generally it's geared to kill the mind rather than to, or the whole system rather than to enable it to develop. No, it's a painful issue at the moment because our new single national curriculum is on the horizon and it's going to be horrible.
I mean, if I may, about Sri Lanka and the education system, as Neelam said, it is, even in Sri Lanka, it's constructed to kill the mind. So you're not encouraged. So it's you're not encouraged to think critically. You cannot challenge power structures, and also the curriculum, in a sense, it is it can be sexist, and also there are a lot of stereotypes about minorities. It's about how history is being taught. So I think generally the education system just exacerbates the social problems we have. So that relates to both men and women. But I think it's the ingrained sexism within society that you then see within the family, the school, which prevents women from assuming leadership roles. So for instance, like, in the Tamil community where, you don't have political analysts or constitutional analysts who are men. So for instance, there was an instance when I wrote something and they put me on this national list of a political party. So I was publishing at the time. So then there were lots of articles and, these very vicious personal attacks that said, oh, she couldn't have written that. There's no way she could have written that. And they said another well-known parliamentarian must have written it. So even the fact that you are a specialist in a particular area is something that women's knowledge and competence is something our societies are unable to acknowledge and accept. And I think that is our fundamental problem.
Yeah. Manushi, you're well placed to talk about students and education. What would you like to say about this?
About the first question regarding the data, I also don't have the exact numbers. But about education, I think I agree with both the speakers that education has the potential to do a lot for women and women's ability to take leadership position. But sadly, in Nepal as well, our education system, in fact, has only been reproducing the existing power structures and the exclusivity of public space and problematic relations, caste hierarchies that exist in society. So there's a lot that needs to be done in that area, and in Nepal, you could think that why didn't anybody, particularly the the Maoists who came with so much of fervor for change and transformation, why wasn't anything done in the educational front? Well, actually, almost everything got subsumed under the whole task of constitution making. So everybody's focus was just on, drafting constitution and ensuring that the more important things like secularism, federalism, etc., were being addressed and institutionalized in the new constitution. And even in terms of education, we've had the general provisions which are progressive, like in terms of stating it as a fundamental right and everything, but the content, nobody really paid attention to the curriculum and the content of what makes good education material. Nobody paid attention to that. And I think I have only myself to criticize, being part of the students' movement. It's something that we completely missed because we ourselves were so much focused on fighting the political struggle and not paying much attention to the educational and other aspects as well. But now that we promulgated the Constitution 2015, I think now is a good time, although we're very late, to start intervening in these areas. So I think education has a very good potential, but as of now, it's not doing such great thing for women politicians.
Yeah. Manushi, there's a related question addressed only to you, so I'll just read that out. What is Manushi's point of view on children of politicians in politics discouraging their parents to advance their political career, unlike the way daughters of Nepali Congress and Communist Party of Nepal have maximized?
Sorry, unlike what? I didn't get the last.
Unlike the way daughters of Nepali Congress and Communist Party of Nepal have maximized. I guess the question means, daughters of politicians in Nepali Congress and the Communist Party have probably used their parents' connection to advance. And what is your view on other parties discouraging their children from being in politics? That's what I understand from the question.
So it's the parents discouraging the children, not the children discouraging the
children not children not wanting to take the advantage of their parents.
Yeah, that's a very interesting question. Yes, that's very true. In Nepal, if you look at the top figures, yes, in Nepali Congress, you have Sujata Koirala. In Communist Party, I think they're referring to Prachanda's family or other leaders, wives and whatnot. But about kids not wanting to, follow the footsteps of their parents, I think that says a lot about the kind of politics that their parents do. And not only that, the convincing capacity of their parents to involve them in the kind of politics that they are leading. But that's not the only issue. I think the bigger issue in Nepal's context is because the living conditions are so harsh. Not everybody does politics out of choice. For the average people, even during the People's War, the Maoist People's War, it was out of compulsion that majority of people participated in these political movements. So after a period of time, it's only those who have enough resources that they can sustain themselves in politics. So for leaders who are slightly in the lower ranks, or leaders who are financially not well off, and that would directly be related sadly to their corrupt practices, I think it's very natural for them not to want their kids, to again follow that very painful path of, being active in politics, but, having to compromise on so many other aspects of life. So, yeah.
This leads us to another question that's come in, which is for everyone. They ask, given the massive expenses of running election campaigns, do you think we can think of campaign finance reforms as one way to level the playing field for women politicians, as well as others from different marginalized groups? Has this come up as a serious political alternative in your countries? Could we start with Hamida? Hamida, I mean, especially because there's been so much talk of corruption, at the level of the Prime Minister, and it's gone to court, and, it's really a public issue, and yet that does not seem to affect electoral prospects.
Yes, Lakshmi, I think we've talked a lot about it, the corruption and we know that everybody who gets into politics also ends up as a business person. So you wonder where it all went. But that's true. This is one of the, I think, obstructions to decent politics, I would say, because even in any campaign, even publicly, you can see how much money is being spent. And it's not a question of buying votes directly, but so many different institutional active and sort of drawing whatever they can, whether it's administration or whether it's law and law enforcement mechanisms, and of course ordinary community people. So of course that is, I think, a hindrance to any honest way to be elected. And in this case particularly, I think women are certainly 2 steps behind, because whereas the men are earning money, or they've been in business and they've been in politics, and as a result of being in politics, they made enough money or have started their own businesses, so they do have that kind of money. Whereas women, when they're into politics, they're getting in for the first time. Not that they're averse to these practices. I feel that whether it's a woman or a man in politics, one way of getting in is actually to use whatever resources that are available to you. And in these cases, I think the party also makes resources available. The various other institutions make resources available, because they can then use you for whatever purpose they have. And it's and I think it's also, if you're new in politics, then it's more difficult for you to use these methods. Whereas you've been in it, or your family has been in it, then you know who's who, and it's easier to access. It's a very simple proposition. So I think certainly there's need for reform, but how do you do it? Can you just wipe out a whole slate and clean it up and do it all over again? Because the kind of money that we saw that was being spent, say, in the American election recently, or various other countries, or even in India, in your last election, people are giving statistics in the media, and that didn't seem to suggest that there was any step back on this. But I think we really need to consider how to change this. And I think I'm always harping on the local communities, but I think one way to start is probably in the local elections, where there is not that much possibility of making money as there is in national parliaments. So I think I would personally feel that one should start at that level and work on a system where citizens are more active in monitoring what's happening and making their findings more public.
Yeah, because a lot of the reform at the higher levels is just another way disguised to make more money. In India, this whole issue of electoral bonds and so on is yet another ruse in a way. So I guess the change does have to come from below. What about the other speakers? Would you like to comment on this about, the money used for election campaigns, and has there been any attempt at reform or changing the system? Do you know of any examples?
Personal experience is when I resigned from the Human Rights Commission of Sri Lanka, the general election that took place last year, I was asked to contest for the parliamentary elections. So one of the reasons I refused, there were many, but one of the main reasons that I refused was, I'm like, how am I going to possibly raise this money? And as someone who's not been in politics, and also whoever was willing to give the funds, I wasn't sure that I really wanted to take those funds, because then you cannot hold on to your positions, and you in a way become tainted, and you become part of the process. In Sri Lanka, it is well known that many of the big businesses, they fund all parties. So they're hedging their bets and covering their bases so that whoever comes into power, they'll be okay. The positive thing we have seen is that after the last general elections, now there is actually conversation to some extent about campaign financing and whether we need to bring in laws. That's a positive, that people are actually thinking about it. But also in Sri Lanka, the problem with national level politics or parliamentary politics is the way the electoral district is structured. So you would have to compete with people from your own party, and you also have to cover large physical areas, which means that's why you need more money. So for us, I think for women, it would be much easier to start at the local government level. They would be more successful than at the national level, taking these practicalities into account.
Yeah. would you like to comment? Actually, we are running out of time and there are some more questions, but Manushi, very quickly.
I will
you'd like
just
to comment?
briefly
Yeah.
say that in Nepal, at least our party has tried to propose an alternative. It's debatable, it's still under discussion, of having a directly elected executive and a fully proportionally elected legislature. So, you know, all the members of parliaments don't have to bear the individual cost. So you vote for a particular party, and only the executive officers are, you know, directly elected. This does not resolve the issue at the local level. How do you tackle, you know, this issue of this vicious circle of taking funds, or, you know, from organizations or agencies, and then, you know, you have to carry their agenda, and you get entrapped in that whole thing. But also your ability as a woman to you know, conduct those tasks of raising funds. So we also have proposed that you know, the state has to bear the cost. I think in some countries it's already being practiced, where you know, minimal allocation of resources is, you know, there for those willing to contest, especially for women. So I think that is one thing that we could do.
Yeah. Yeah, and some countries like India, technically there's a cap also on expenses during elections. Not that there aren't ways it's circumvented. I mean, it's India after all. So actually, there's a question addressed to everyone, but a specific one for Neelam. So maybe Neelam, you can answer your specific question and then get on to the general one. So the specific one for Neelam is, how do you think feminist movements in Pakistan have impacted or permeated into public policy? That's your question. And for everyone, according to the UN report from a few years ago, on average, women hold only 7% of ministerial positions and 15% in national parliaments in the region. What are your thoughts on the gender quotas that have been introduced to increase female political participation? Yeah, so Neelam, do you want to take your question and then and the other?
Well, there has been an impact of the women's movement on policy. I mean, the increase in women's representation in parliament is one example. I mean, I'm not saying it was the only factor, but I think it was a major factor, the work done by the women's movement in terms of consultations and discussions and working out how to go about it, and then holding discussions with the bureaucrats, etc., and applying the pressure. Similarly, many of the laws that have the proactive laws, like I don't have them in front of me at the moment, but laws dealing to honor killing, to acid throwing, to prevention of, what do they call it, bad practices. I mean, you know, like exchange marriage and marriage to the Quran to save the property from going to the girl, etc., etc. Those have been initiated by women, pushed by women outside and then inside parliament. So I mean, we've not had as much impact as we would like on policy, but there is a constant endeavor to push for change, whether it's by going through the law courts, whether by direct pressure through parliament, or again through overall awareness raising on issues at the public level. But I mean, as I said, not enough, as much impact as we would like, but I think to some extent, yes.
Okay. And the general question about quotas, do you think they're effective, and what's your thoughts about it? Gender quotas for parliament.
I think quotas have helped, because without quotas, given the patriarchal mindset, the family hierarchies, other considerations, few women would, and women's lack of resources. women don't have the money to fight elections unless they have family support. But once the quota is there and the space is there, and then because male parliamentarians also see that it's one way of getting their foot into the door, a little more space over there, they then also support women. Whether then it's another matter that once in parliament, women have tended to make a space for themselves which is separate from that of their families. Not everybody, but by and large. And in a recent study undertaken by Aisha Khan and Sana Naqvi, they interviewed women, and while women, one of the comments or concerns is that women who come in through quota are not directly responsible to their constituencies, but to the families or the parties who brought them in. The women themselves felt they were answerable to their notional constituencies and not to the parties or the men who had facilitated who had nominated them. So, what was the question?
No, how effective quotas are? That was.
Yeah, I think quotas are effective because without the quotas, there is no way that women would have even that much of an inroad into parliament or into local government as has been enabled by the quota. And even with the quota, I mean, Musharraf gave the 17%, the 33% initially in 2002, 2000 to 2002, and then arbitrarily took it back, reduced it, probably because of backlash from the more conservative elements. And it does impact. At the moment, there are fewer women who are active in politics because, again, of party politics. So you do need quotas.
Would anyone else like to come in on this?
Yeah,
on quotas? Yeah.
Lakshmi, I would like to say that I think quotas might be necessary because otherwise communities or groups are being excluded. In order to make it more inclusive, perhaps we need to have quotas, but we need to have quotas in such a way that women of different classes and different communities can be able to contest, whether it's women or men, so that Chakmas or Shantas or Dalits can also have an opportunity. And it's not just middle-class women or businessmen's wives who are doing this. And I think if we have quotas, we should also look at how that quotas does not mean a selection process. It should be a popularly elected process so that women are then responsible, the women who are elected are then responsible to groups of others who vote for them.
Yeah. Ambika?
Yes, in Sri Lanka, we've actually had a long struggle asking for quotas. And we finally got 25% quotas at the local government level. But even then, even while implementing it, hasn't been smooth because the excuse that the party leaders gave at the time is that even when we have quotas, we can't find women. So now we're afraid that what's going to happen is that the quota will once again, when we move towards the next election, we have to protect the quota because it has seen an increased number of women going in. And yes, many of them are struggling, but many of them are also holding their own. So I think it has had some impact. But for us, it's going to be a battle and a struggle to even hold on to that.
Manashi?
Yeah, I feel that quotas are important and are effective, especially, because for women, there are so many distractions, apart from, of course, the lack of, all sorts of resources. It's very difficult to, remain focused in politics despite your desire and ability to want to perform. So I think quotas are very important, and also important to consider that we should not treat women as a homogeneous category, as somebody already stated. But I'm all for fully proportional representation, not only representation but proportional. So because in a country like ours where there's been very disproportionate consumption and allocation of political resources, economic and even cultural resources, I think quotas are important, but not the only solution. There are so many other things that you would need to do. But if you want to intervene at an institutional level in terms of building mechanisms to ensure women's participation, then quotas are a must.
Yeah, thank you. And I think this is the discussion also in India in terms of, going beyond the women's reservation bill in India. It's only 33% reservation, but there's been such a backlash, such hostility to the very idea itself. And, the whole principle of representation is being, I would say, misused to stall the bill, saying that just having a quota is going to, women's quota will bring in more elite women or upper caste women, and therefore we should not have quota. But the point being, therefore we should try and see how to have more representative quotas. But again, it's just languishing, this bill. And India has only 13% women in parliament. But I'd just like to share one interesting fact here that, in the 2019 general election in India, only 9% of the candidates were women, but 14% of those who were elected were women, which means that fewer women were put up, but more women won. So obviously there's an issue here also at the level of the political parties and their commitment to fielding women. And therefore, then the discussion needs to go to looking at maybe not quotas within political parties, whether they'd be open to that is a different question. But how does one increase women's representation within political parties itself? So, even then being fielded on general seats, because winnability factor is very high in India. And I only have figures for India where there is no large gender gap in the electorate. Equal numbers of men and women go out to vote. Unlike the US, where women are fewer in number in terms of the electorate. So these are questions which actually need a much more systemic change, as everybody has been speaking. And I just wrap up after this last question, which was addressed to me about, do I see more possibilities of women leaders coming up in regional parties or regional elections in India? And, there are very many prominent women, whether it's Mayawati or Mamata Banerjee or Jayalalitha and so on. But again, like we've been talking for the past couple of hours, this hasn't translated into either more gender just policies or even more policies of social justice. They've replicated the way in which men function. So it does not really matter in terms of whether they are women or men. In terms of regional politics playing a part in India, that's definitely so. Again, all of these women have risen within their parties because of mentors. They all happen to be unmarried. Again, it's worth studying whether this is a coincidence or not. But they have had strong male mentors within the party who've sort of, spotlighted their talent when they were young and, groomed them, so to speak. But in terms of the nature of politics, it does not leave much. In fact, there's been so much criticism of the authoritarianism of Jayalalitha, for example, or Mayawati, for example. So it again goes back to the question of, female essentialism and whether that's going to make a difference. And I think we can all conclude that just in and of itself, it's not going to be transformatory to have more women in politics. So I'd like to end over here and thank you all speakers. It's been fantastic. Thank you all the listeners for sticking it out on a Sunday afternoon. It's been really exciting. Thank you so much.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you, Lakshmi.
Yeah, hi. No, thank you, everyone. It was an amazing discussion. I just wanted to end by reminding everyone of Himal's membership program, which you can join by going to himalmag.com, and it'll support our work, and hopefully we can have more of these conversations in the future. Yeah, thanks everyone again, and Lakshmi also for expertly guiding our conversation today. So thanks everyone.